greed is like a fire. It consumes everything it touches and is never satisfied, always seeking more fuel. The greed is this virus. Once it's inside of you, it becomes a boss. It is the CEO of your mind, and it is telling you how to cut costs and how to save money and how to get more. And the problem with it is never, ever. Let's just say we snap our fingers magically. They are all super generous and not greedy. But wait a minute. Ultimately, it's the shareholders that they're trying to appease. And that's the cycle. And we can say, yeah, he's got all the money in the world, but that insatiable need for more does not mean that he is happy. Being one of the three evils, greed ultimately leads to the consequences of late-stage capitalism, and the consequences of greed are where we are now. We have insane amounts of wealth disparity. Killing a CEO may make some people feel better because they feel they've gotten justice. He's just going to be replaced. We want to be like Neo. Neo is calm, collected, acts with intention, acts with efficiency and directiveness. And once we do this with a clear, calm, stable, and pure mind, we can approach this in a very different way. Hello, and welcome. Welcome back to the Passing Moments of Existence podcast. I'm your host, Bradley Marcus Is, and today I have a very, very special episode for you. I think it couldn't be of any better timing, actually. Today's episode is all about greed. If you're new here, my name is Bradley Marcus Is, and what we discuss on this specific podcast is Theravāda Buddhist practice, the philosophy, the psychology, and how we can apply it into our daily lives. And many of you who follow me may already know this. Greed is one of the three evils in Buddhism, or in Theravada Buddhism. And what that means is that it is one of the three reasons that people do bad things, basically. This episode might challenge some of you. It might confuse you or make you feel challenged in some way. So I ask you to just come at this with an open mind. The reason I'm talking about greed today is because it is so prevalent in our society. I have a beautiful podcast that I've worked very hard on, and I think it's going to give you a great understanding of what greed is and what we can do to fight against it. Because again, if we want to fight against this corporate greed that we see in the West and America, we have to understand it. We have to know why. Furthermore, I actually will also say that I think that as you go down the path of understanding greed, you'll actually start to change your perspective on it. And we'll get more into that in a little bit. So keep an eye out for that later in this podcast. But yeah, let's just jump right into it. Obviously, greed is a huge topic right now in our society because of what happened recently. And I think it was sometime in December where that United Healthcare CEO was gunned down in New York City. A lot of people are saying that this was well-deserved, right? And it's opened up this kind of class consciousness, this understanding also of class disparity, and how a lot of us want to fight against greed because of the fact that we are being treated very poorly and that actually many people have passed away because of greed. And I think many Americans and many people in the West and many people in developed countries are very confused. Why are we such a developed country, yet we have some of the worst healthcare? We can't support our elderly or our sick in ways that allow them to live happy and fulfilling lives. So greed, it's at the core issue of all of this. And we're going to talk about how this greed in society, specifically with the United States, within the system that we have, and how it creates so many issues and what we can do about it. Greed isn't only about individual failings, right? This is a systematic issue, and I'm going to hit that a few times and repeat it a few times because I think it really needs to be understood, especially when we're talking about corporate structures in America. Somebody was like, yeah, that guy deserves it, the United Healthcare CEO. And I remember the first thing I thought of was like, okay, sure, he deserves it. But let's just say all of a sudden that he was like Jesus or the Buddha and decided to all of a sudden just be extremely generous and start accepting every person's claim. He would get fired very quickly, and then he would be replaced. He's going to be replaced anyway, which is another funny aspect of it all, where it's like, oh, we think that we're kind of fighting against the machine, when in reality, it's just a three-headed dragon, so to speak. You cut one head off, another head grows back. However, that doesn't mean that this act of violence hasn't sparked a conversation. In the end, though, this episode will give you guys the tools on how to recognize and address greed within your society, within yourself, within your community. All of it's going to be based in Buddhist practice and Theravada Buddhist philosophy. So what is greed? Greed is also known as lobha. Lobha is the Pali word for greed. It also translates to lust, and it is one of the three evils. Greed is what is called a unwholesome mind state, or akusala. There are three akusalas, or unwholesome mind states, and it's important that we understand that word unwholesome can also kind of relate to evil or bad. These are mind states that we need to be reflecting in our own practice. How are we acting in our daily lives? Are we acting wholesomely or unwholesomely? So if we are acting out of greed, we're acting unwholesomely. And it arises from clinging, from attachment, and the insatiable desire for more. Of course, we can desire things in our lives, but there's a difference between insatiable desire, clinging, attachment, harming others with our desire. In the Samyutta Nikaya Sutta, we have greed as the hindrance to the Noble Eightfold Path. And if you are a practicing Buddhist, or if you're just getting into Theravada Buddhism as well, or if you just want to learn a little bit more about philosophy, the Eightfold Path is the way that a person leads themselves to enlightenment. They achieve enlightenment through the Eightfold Path. So as somebody who practices Theravada Buddhism, greed is a hindrance to that path. And also, guys, greed is not limited to just wealth. And I think that that's another really important thing here. Greed is not only about money. And we're going to talk here in a moment about some analogies that I think are incredible, that will really put greed into perspective for you. But understand that it can manifest as an attachment to power, to status, and even an idea. That's something that I want, and I am now attached to it. And that could lead to greedy actions, right? Remember that we can have greed to ideas, to power, to status, the way things should be, to the way things shouldn't be, and of course to money, and many more things. So greed is the action, the lust, the insatiable desire for more, whatever it is. Also understand that greed is really a reaction to fear and insecurity. Like really, when you start looking at the psychological reasoning, and again, we want to understand greed so we can understand the people that are greedy, and so we can better attack the situation. So these people that are greedy, and this system also that is greedy, it's really just reacting in a fearful and insecure way. And it really does drive people to hoard and cling things as they perceive as stabilizing their identity, right? Or their worth. It's like, I need to have all these things so I can have a stable identity of I am a powerful person. There's a certain point where it is insatiable, where it's harming others, and these are the questions we have to ask ourselves. Remember, desire and greed are different. It's very important you understand that. Lust and desire are different. Unwholesome and wholesome mind states are different. So you can still desire something and be wholesome. I'm going to slow down my speech because I think I'm talking very fast right now. It's probably the last bit of coffee I had today. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some analogies. This is one of my favorite analogies. I read this in a book written by a monk. I was in Thailand and I just happened to stumble across a temple. I wanted to check out a temple in the morning and do some alms rounds and give some food to some monks. And I came across, I think it was Wat Lok Moli, I think it is. It's one of the oldest temples in Chiang Mai. And I was just walking around the temple and I stumbled into the library and I grabbed the first English book that I could that was written in Roman script and something I could learn. And I flipped to a random page. And this monk who wrote it, I think about 100 years ago, said something that really resonated with me. And of course, right, like I happened to flip to a random page and it's like, boom, something perfect. Greed is like a boss that you can never appease. It always demands more and it leaves you exhausted and unfulfilled. I'm going to say it again because that is fucking powerful. Greed is like a boss that you can never appease, always demands more. It will always leave you exhausted and unfulfilled. So there is this boss that is greed. And once you let it in, it gets its claws into you more and more and more. And my gosh, man, if you look around at some of the greedy people, you can see them trying to appease their boss. I also like to look at it like a virus. It spreads within you. And once you're infected, you can start to infect others. People who are not practicing wholesome mind states can be affected because they say, well, if he's being greedy, then I'm going to be greedy too. If he's taking everything, well, then I'm just going to take everything. And this is what we have to unlearn as a society. And this is a big part of what I'm trying to do on this podcast is create new neural networks in our brains that represent love, compassion, generosity, and kindness. And the reason that we want to do that, my friends, is then the next generations will have a bit more of that, and the next through epigenetics. We can unlearn things that are detrimental to our fellow peers and we can learn things that are helpful. When we were cavemen, maybe some greedy mentality might have been helpful at certain times, but that doesn't mean it still doesn't cause harm. It doesn't mean that we can't still be better people. Like, it's time to evolve, my friends. That's kind of what I'm talking about here. So again, the greed is this virus. Once it's inside of you, it becomes a boss. It is the CEO of your mind, and it is telling you how to cut costs and how to save money and how to get more. And the problem with it, it is never, ever happy. It's never happy. Keep that in mind as you go throughout your day. Where are you being greedy? And what are you being greedy with? Could be your self-worth. It could be an idea that you have. It could be power, status, money, whatever. It could be the last bite of food that you want, but your partner is asking you for a bite. Another analogy that is actually referenced here in the Adittapariyaya Sutta is the fire sermon. And it is this fire analogy that greed is like a fire. It consumes everything it touches and is never satisfied, always seeking more fuel. So again, it describes that greed and hatred and delusion, these three evils, can become like a fire in the mind. Once you light that fire, it is just going to keep burning. It's going to find whatever it can to keep burning. So if I lit a fire right here in this room, the fire would consume each and every piece of material in this room that it could and burn. So the goal is not to light that fire. And if you're a practicing Buddhist, or if you want to just practice being less greedy, it's really important that you have mindfulness, okay? That's why we meditate. We want to have mindfulness of thought so that when that unwholesome mind does come, we stop it at the source. We uproot it. We put that fire out before it starts. That's the practice of Buddhism. That's the practice of Theravada Buddhism, stopping it at its source and uprooting the unwholesome mind states and then replacing them with a wholesome one. Greed often stems from a sense of lack or fear of impermanence, right? Everything is impermanent. So there's no point to chase this thing to the end of the earth because it will change on its own eventually. Whether that's the value of the dollar, whether that's how much money you have, or whether that's your own life. You can't take it with you into the next one. So what's the point of trying to hoard as much wealth as possible when at the moment of death, you can't do anything with it anyway? I think it's really important that we understand that people who are so greedy are really on a deep level, guys, just afraid. They're just scared. They're scared they're going to run out. And whether it's a nervous tick in their head or a traumatic experience, or whether it's the virus that took hold of them and they never worked on getting it out, and it's just burned so much in their mind now that it's ever consuming fire. Whatever the case and whatever the reason, it is a fear of this impermanence and a fear of lack. And many other fears, perhaps, fear of not being the best, fear of whatever. It's also, though, driven by delusion, which is the third root of evil, and is actually the main root of evil, that greed and hatred come out of ignorance or delusion, and that is known as moha. It's this idea, this delusion that accumulating more wealth, power, recognition will bring happiness, which we know is not true, guys. We know that these people are not happy, man. Let's talk about how understanding greed helps us fight it a bit more. So as we know now about greed being this fear of lack, understanding what greed really is, how it comes into the body and the mind, we have to understand it's really become a universal tendency as a human, and understanding that will allow us to confront it without this kind of self-righteousness, or I deserve this, or why are they doing it, but why can't I be that? It's a negative self-tendency that we need to unlearn. And with that, we can do it without self-righteousness or hatred. And so when we see this greed as a reaction born of fear and delusion, our response can shift to, are you ready? Compassion. And that's what I meant earlier about this understanding that it is a fear, right? So if someone's afraid and we on the other end are observing this, right? We are on the other end observing this with truth and understanding and wisdom that this greed will not bring happiness, and they are afraid, well, then we can hold compassion for them. It's like, oh man, you don't understand it. You don't get it. And I'm sure some people right now might be a little challenged in this. And that's what I was saying earlier is, you may be challenged. Why am I holding compassion for somebody who's so terrible, greedy, and hurts people? And it's because they lack the understanding of the truth. They lack the understanding of what is really happiness. And so with this, we approach it with this higher level mentality, above mentality, not in the sense that we're better than them, but we have this more mature understanding. And within that, we can hold compassion to them. We do this in practice as well, so we can understand the triggers of greed in our own lives, right? Because it is a reaction of fear and delusion. So if we have greed greed within our own experience, then we are afraid of something and we have this delusion in our own experience. So we can begin to counteract that with intentional acts of generosity and non-attachment, which we'll talk about a little bit more here in a second. And why would we want to do this? Because it's going to make a better world, okay? By acting in this way, we will have a mental clarity, pure mind, and it gives us more control as well. That's another really important thing is, a lot of people want control, and we're in these positions in this class, let's say that's lower, it's class disparity, where we feel we don't have control. In doing this, we gain control. We gain control over our own suffering. We gain control over our own suffering and the suffering that we create for others. And once we do this with a clear, calm, stable, and pure mind, we can approach this in a very different way. We can start to hold peace within ourselves as we move forward, still being active, still being engaged, still fighting against the greed, but doing so in a way that is so much more efficient and much less energy is being expended. It's kind of like Neo. I always think of a monk being like Neo, or vice versa. I guess Neo is more like a monk, probably based on, the character himself. We want to be like Neo. We want to break through the matrix, right? Okay, well, how do we do that? What does Neo do? How does Neo act? Does Neo flare his arms around and scream and run? And no, dude, Neo is calm, collected, acts with intention, acts with efficiency and directiveness. And yeah, I'm just thinking about that movie. It's incredible. I love that movie. You should watch that. I think that's the only 10 out of 10 movie that I would ever rate 10 out of 10. That. I was going to say The Whale, but The Whale is like a 9.8 for me. Understanding that it gives us more clarity and it is just more an efficient and wise way to approach the situation. Here's a supporting study that I'd like to reference about materialism. It is Kasser T in 2002. It highlights how materialistic values foster dissatisfaction and harm mental health, right? So this materialistic value, having everything be materialistic that is of value in our lives, really actually can harm our mental health. It's important to you guys to remember that this greed is a cycle. Not only is it a virus, a fire, a boss, but it is a cycle. And the more we indulge in it, the harder it is to break free. On a scientific standpoint, that makes a lot of sense, right? Neural networks, neurons that fire together, wire together. So the more that we engage in this greed, the more neural networks we're creating in the brain, the more pathways we're creating, and the more we become greedy. So it's important that we start practicing the opposite of greed, which you probably can have guessed by now, but if not, we'll talk about it soon. And that's how we are going to break free, and that's how we're going to change the world. Also, I want you guys to remember that greed does reinforce inequality and systematic exploitation, okay? Greed does reinforce those things. So that can lead to this unrest and dissatisfaction at every level of society. Again, it's important to understand that it is in a cycle and it does lead to these societal changes because people learn from one another and observe, and they have this self-righteousness about themselves. So this is really about removing yourself in a way that gives you clarity and pure mind so we can then attack it in a much more efficient and wholesome way. Let's talk a little bit about the consequences of greed as well. The Buddha said that all bad things that people do in the world are because of the three evils: greed, hatred, or delusion. So many, many bad things happen to people because of greed. If you want to challenge that, just think of any bad thing that's ever happened caused by a person, and you will find that at the root of it was greed, hatred, or delusion. And that's why these three evils are also known as the three roots, or the three roots of evil. So it's important. They are the root, the cause of these reasons. Things like class disparity, corporate greed, withholding resources. And of course, then there's the systematic greed where competition perpetuates this inequality. And I think that's where I can just in a moment talk a bit about late stage capitalism, right? I mean, the consequences of late stage capitalism and the consequences of greed are where we are now. We have insane amounts of wealth disparity. Insane in the most developed country in the world, and everybody knows it, and now we're just really starting to talk about it. So it's really important that we remember, though, that it is a systematic approach. Killing a CEO may make some people feel better because they feel they've gotten justice. It's just going to be replaced. And even if we do get a good guy in there, well, then that's not going to meet the profit margins that the board of directors want and the shareholders want, and so they'll replace him. So again, it's a systematic thing, guys. There is a systematic approach that we need to be taking to change this because they're just going to be replaced again and again anyway. So we need to change that. And right now, greed is the social norm. This is a mob mentality. Greed is the social norm. And a lot of people mimic each other's greed, which perpetuates this cycle. In the Chakravarti Sihanada Sutta, greed literally listed as the cause of social decline. This is one of the greatest things I love about reading suttas and learning about Theravada Buddhism, is that the more I learn about it, the more I am like, yes, they got it. Yes, that I agree with that. That makes sense. Greed as a cause of social decline or societal decline. It is literally listed. The Buddha literally said this 2,500 years ago. It's just, it's very impactful when you stop for a moment and just think about that. It's so powerful in what it is, and I think we need to take a moment to think about that. So I'm going to actually have a mindfulness 5 or 10 seconds, just thinking about greed, contemplating greed and how it will lead to societal decline. And in that, we can reflect on ourselves as well, and how we can be better people every day and not be so greedy. Thanks for having that with me. That's where we are, guys. We are with this societal norm that greed is normal, that we have to gather as much as possible, and we have to not share it with anybody. And look where that got us, huh? We need to band together to stop this. And to be clear, I'm not one to say that you can't want and desire more money for yourself and your family, more security, more convenience, etc. But I think we all agree there's a point, or there's a way about going about doing it where it is unwholesome, and there's a point where it's definitely too much. Right now, let's talk a little bit about how greed actually impacts an individual. This is going to be another challenging thing for you, perhaps, if you are unfamiliar with this practice and this philosophy. But I ask you to stick with me, and I'm going to try and explain it in a few different angles so you can have a better understanding. And I also want you to know that you don't have to agree with it right now. What I recommend instead is that you sit with what I'm about to tell you, because it will take a bit of contemplation, as we call it in Buddhist practice. So greed, being one of the 3 evils, means that greed ultimately leads to personal suffering for the individual who's being greedy. So the guy who's being greedy is actually suffering. The guy who's being hateful and ignorant is actually suffering. And that may challenge you, but I ask you to think about it like this. When was the last time you were greedy? And did you enjoy that feeling? The last time you finished an ice cream and you were like, God, I really want another ice cream. Was that a pleasant feeling? Wanting more? You finally graduated from college and it felt good for a couple days, but then the greed started setting in. You started wanting more and you started suffering. Remember, in Buddhist practice, suffering is the main thing we're trying to attack, the main thing we're trying to focus on, and how to liberate ourselves from suffering. And then in the second noble truth, it is said that suffering comes from clinging, comes from attachment, comes from greed, hatred, and ignorance. So we have to apply that now, okay? So if you understand that, and you can again sit with this, pause the podcast, quiet yourself, quiet your mind, get into a meditative stance, meditate for 15 minutes on what I just said. Greed is the cause of suffering. And once you are at a place where you can sort of pick it up or fully pick it up and be like, hell yeah, I totally get it. Now I want you to flip it. Think about the greedy person. Think about what they're experiencing. And we can say, yeah, he's got all the money in the world, but that insatiable need for more does not mean that he is happy at all. And it means the opposite. It means he is suffering. This is a very, very powerful truth, my friends. This is what the entire practice is based on. And when we understand that, we can hold compassion for him. We can almost, I don't like to use the word pity, because some people will say that word. It's not pity, it's compassion. Remember, compassion is understanding what a person is experiencing and acknowledging it, acknowledging their suffering. This is actually one of the 4 divine abodes in Buddhist practice, also known as karuna, compassion, understanding another person's suffering, feeling it. So, in the Samayutta Nikaya, we can reflect on this dissatisfaction that greed brings. And the line is, this too is a way to understand all the suffering that arises is rooted and sourced in desire, for the desire is the root of suffering. Satu. Yeah, sometimes I get emotional when I do these podcasts, because it's just fucking true, man. It's like, how often are we just wanting more, never ending? And when you finally release from that, when you finally let that go, you find peace, dude. You find peace, my friends. Satu. If you guys don't know, Satu means well said in Pali. because that was the quote from the Buddha. So I'm saying it to that. Let's talk about a supporting study as well. Akin L.B. in 2013, the study Giving Leads to Happiness in Young Children, where they actually studied that and highlights how generosity is the antidote to greed. And we've touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to brush through it. Greed in corporate and systematic spaces. We have to understand that greed does manifest itself in corporations. It does manifest itself in society as a system. Okay, remember that. It's a systematic thing. It's not just a guy. It's not just this one dude who's super greedy, and if we just got rid of him, everything would be great. There's always someone to appease in the corporate world, and this is, again, how we're going to fight the system that we have. We have to understand how it works. So, you think that this guy who's laying off people is a dick, right? Why would he do that? That's so messed up. Well, let's play with it a bit. Well, he has to appease his boss, who's saying that they need to cut costs so they can make their profit margins. Well, why do they need to make their profit margins? Well, for one, they want to get their bonus, greed, of course. But on top of that, if they don't, they could get fired, which is their whole entire livelihood at that point of being. So that boss needs to appease his boss, and then that boss needs to appease his boss all the way up to the CEO. But then what about the CEO? Why doesn't the CEO just be not such a dick? Oh, okay. Well, it's because then they have a board member or the board of directors saying, hey, if you want to run this appropriately, you need to make us happy by giving us profits. Okay, well, if the board of directors were just cool, let's just say we snap our fingers magically, they are all super generous and not greedy. But wait a minute. Ultimately, it's the shareholders that they're trying to appease. It goes right back down to the bottom. And that's the cycle. But what I'm saying again is it's a systematic approach. It does not just work by offing one person or getting rid of a board of directors, because really it comes down to these shareholders. It's a systematic approach. Everybody is trying to be greedy. Everybody is trying to get more. And the system, being unregulated, allows that to happen. It really doesn't mean that one CEO is the problem, right? Or the board of directors. When we look at the actual system, it comes right back down. Individual ethical decisions are often overridden by systematic greed. And in the Dhammapada verse 355, greed blinds people to ethical considerations. That virus, man, that boss, that fire, it's blinding you. Another supporting study for this in 1970, Friedman M., the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, critiques the moral implications of corporate greed. Again, as a system, if you're a business, you have to grow. And in order to grow, you got to be greedy. While it is great to protest and obviously have these conversations, we also all need to vote. We need to take action in our local communities and start there. I think that if enough people were to get on the same page with how to approach these situations politically with efficiency and directiveness, we could really make major changes, bringing in the right people. Of course, those right people could develop the greed. They could get the virus. So we'd have to either have them change the system quickly, or B, really pick the right people who are like a Bernie Sanders, let's say, who is not just there for the greed, who really wants the betterment of people. And that does take time and effort, and there's always going to be forces against it. But I do not believe that it's impossible. I believe it is very possible. So we have to get the right people in the political system to eliminate things like lobbying. Like that should not exist at this point. Or if it is lobbying, it should be individual lobbying. No campaigns should be able to take contributions from corporate entities. It should be individuals, and there should be limits. All right, now let's talk about something that we all want to talk about, which is how do we fix this? What is the antidote to greed? And funny enough, there's actually a word for it. Greed is lobha, and in Buddhist practice, the opposite of greed is alobha, which simply means generosity. And it is the antidote to the poison, right? I said there's these 3 roots of evil. They're also known as the 3 poisons. Well, guess what? We have the 3 antidotes. We have the 3 roots of good, the 3 roots of wholesomeness: generosity, compassion, and wisdom. Let's talk about generosity. Now, generosity is a wholesome mind state. Generosity is a core virtue in Buddhism. It is a direct antidote to clinging. One of the references is the Dana Sutta, which just talks about the benefits of generosity. Now, as I said earlier, greed is not just about money, so neither is generosity. We can be generous with time, with ideas. We can be generous in forgiving. My God. I think we need more of that. So letting go of grudges is a form of generosity, forgiving somebody, even if they don't say sorry. That's something I struggled with for a while. You don't have to have somebody say sorry. You can forgive them on your own. And in a sense, you're kind of forgiving yourself for being so greedy. And you're forgiving the action. You don't need somebody else to apologize to you. It is the antidote to clinging. So if we're clinging to the fact that this person has to say sorry to me, we can forgive them and let that go. If we cling to the fact that we need this much status or this much money or this much power, we can let that go. We are being generous with our money. We are being generous with our power. And a lot of times we're really just being generous with these ideas that we're holding and clinging to. If you have this idea that you need to make $1 million a year and you are clinging to it, then you are suffering. So in order to not suffer, you let go of the idea, but not just the idea, but rather the attachment to it. And this is the art form that is Theravada practice. You are letting go of the attachment to the idea. You can still desire $1 million a year. Like that's, a nice income. That would be wonderful. You can still desire that for whatever reasons that you want, but there's a difference between clinging to it and then in turn suffering and then in turn causing pain and suffering to others. They cling to the idea of it. They push others down. They harm others to get to it. And that in turn causes pain for others. And they are suffering in the process. It's just like a big mess of suffering. Let's talk a quick second though about something that I would like you guys to practice. If you want to be more generous, right? If you want to understand that generosity is the antidote to greed, and it is the antidote to being greedy with time, money, ideas, the way things should be, experiment being generous every day or whenever you can. Share your time. Next time somebody that is asking you for a moment of your time, give it to them. You're not being greedy with your time. You're being generous with it. Forgive somebody. You're not being greedy with holding a grudge and making them feel bad that they need to feel terrible. You can be generous with it. And in that, you instantly liberate yourself from suffering. You can give up an idea. And what I mean by give up is not eliminate it, not remove it, but let go of it. It's still there, floating. It's still there, but you're not suffering anymore. Here's a nice little study done W and Aiken, L&B, and Norton, MI, in 2008. Spending money on others actually promotes happiness. And it does. It's been replicated many, many times by giving money to others, whether it be a charity, a friend, a homeless person, buying somebody a gift, whatever. It actually makes you happier. It's crazy. Practice that. But let's talk about how we do it in the actual system itself. We want to encourage generosity as a counterbalance to greed at a societal level. Encourage generosity as a counterbalance to greed at a societal level. That starts with me and you, baby. We need leaders that prioritize social welfare over profit. Some leaders start that way and the greed takes over. That virus comes in. So we have to make sure that we pick people who are strong-minded, people who understand the value of a human life over the value of a dollar. So you need somebody who has really good moral structure. And as a Buddhist, this is called sila. It's the foundation of our practice. It means morality. So we have to be moral. We have to not harm others. We have to be wholesome with our mind states. We have to be generous. We have to be kind. Be good people. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't harm. And in doing so, we have that strong foundation that we can sit upon. And when a greedy person walks into the room, we have our foundation of sila to rest upon. People that have good morality. These are the people we want to elect. So if you're looking at somebody to elect, I'd recommend you learn about them. Maybe go meet them if you can, stare them in the eye and have a conversation with them and see if they are just faking it. Are they really who they say they are? How are they going to act in a hard time when they're surrounded by the greed? Remember, it just starts with one though, okay? The more that we practice this, the more that we find people that practice this and uplift them, the more we will see change. So we need to find the right people. We need to be the right people ourselves. We need to encourage this act. We need to speak about it more, this wholesome, generous way of being. Because once we do, that is a spark that can turn into a beautiful flame that can lead us to a place of generosity, of equality, of happiness, of peace, of everybody having healthcare, of everybody having groceries we can afford. But as soon as we start being greedy ourselves, we're simply perpetuating the cycle. That's the Buddhist perspective on this. And I want us to focus on generosity, guys. I think there's a huge turning point in our society. And we have the opportunity to be beacons of light and to be generous and kind people, to show others that it is okay to be this way. And that in fact, it's a great thing, man. Let's stop uplifting greed, hatred, and ignorance and lying, and let's uplift the right things. And we do that by being beacons of light ourselves. And there are many practices, by the way, meditative practices that give you the faculty to deal with hard situations. And if you want to learn more of those, give me a like right now on this video if you've been with me this long. As a conclusion, greed is the root cause of suffering for all individuals and society. And I want you guys also to reflect on how changing this mindset around greed and generosity can really influence this larger system. Remember, we are changing the way our brain works, which means our children and our children's children will have different brains. And as we continue to teach them and practice this, we will change the world, literally. Remember, the world becomes kinder and more equitable through this generosity, one moment at a time, and that's how I empower you today. So I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast on greed. Meditate today if you haven't already, or meditate tomorrow. Contemplate some of the things that you may have learned in this podcast. You can write them down as well and take them into your practice and sit with it. I wish you well on this journey, and please share this with somebody who needs to know what greed is all about. And let's start a movement moving forward. Yeah, I love you. See you next time.